Yeah, so good evening and welcome to uh, the third lecture, uh, uh, the third session of this lecture series uh, in this episode of Sea Conversations. My name is Prasad Shetty and I work at the School of Environment and Architecture here. And I welcome all of them here and all people on online through our Facebook page or Instagram page or YouTube channel. Um, the idea of the Bookmaker series, which is this series or this episode of Sea Conversation, uh, actually spiraled off from uh, this book, uh, which we are going to launch today, the first launch in India. Uh, and the book is by uh, our my dear friend and uh, your teacher, Prasad Khanolkar. Uh, the book is important for a variety of reasons, and I'll come to that in a moment. Uh, Before that, let me just tell you about the Bookmaker series. The Bookmaker series is about people who who who've made books, not only made books but also uh, who have collected books, who have uh, worked with books over worked with some others books, engaged with others books in many ways. So we'll have fiction writers, non-fiction writers, biographers, translators, uh, collectors, and different kinds of bookmakers. And the series also has a different form. Today is a book launch. Uh, the earlier two were conversations. Uh, there is an exhibition. The last one is an exhibition. Uh, then it is, one of it has a workshop mode. So we'll experiment with all of those things. And uh, books as an experimental form, uh, uh, as a form to kind of hold uh, uh, ideas and thoughts and propositions, uh, and also, you know, stories of places and stories of a variety of stories from variety of places. And this book does all of it, uh, in the most joyful way one can think of. It's around 150 pages, 180 pages, and it's very lucid to kind of read through. It's full of stories, notes, diary, conversations, letters, a whole lot of drawings, diagrams, uh, fictional pieces, non-fictional pieces. It's a pleasure to just go through it. Uh, Prasad has been a very old and dear friend. Uh, we grew up together actually, uh, and uh, uh, grew up intellectually. We grew together, and in many ways, the book kind of holds our orientation uh, to the urban as well, our orientation and optics on the urban as well. Uh, Prasad is trained as an architect and a planner. Uh, he has multiple degrees: a PhD from University of Toronto, uh, planning degree from Cornell University, architecture degree from Mumbai University. He's worked in a number of places. Uh, in Mumbai, of course, but also in Gurgaon, in Nairobi, in Addis Ababa. He taught at the IIT Guwahati. He worked in Bangalore, a huge number of places. Uh, his itinerary is quite exciting to kind of just follow. Uh, and in 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 these uh, um, in this in this journey, uh, this book comes up uh, as a consolidation of many of the thoughts, many of the ideas, and many of the methods and propositions on cities. Uh, the book is titled Passages of Play in Urban India. It's Routledge, published by Routledge 2023. Uh, uh, I think it's available on Amazon at the moment. In India, it's expensive, but I have circulated a copy. So uh, the thing is that this uh, and as we discuss the book and as he kind of presents the book, you'll notice uh, this fierce urge to 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 reconstitute the way we think about urban space, informality, slum, and a whole lot of things that uh, that city planners and city thinkers have spoken about, particularly the instrumentalist ones. And the urge to this reconstitution really comes from uh, the the field work and his journeys and his uh, you know stays at various localities across these cities that he follows. And in one section of the book is also there is one fictional city, a fictional place which is basically a constellation of many cities together. So I won't take more time now. I'll come back uh, with uh, with some points on the book later. And with me today will be Isha. Where are you, Isha? Yeah, Isha, who will join us to respond on the book, uh, uh, which is after Prasad presents his book. Prasad Khanolkar.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Prasad, Anuj, and I mean the members of the CC for just putting this together, and all of you for coming out. So, I mean, as Prasad said, the book is really a latest iteration of an inquiry into slums that has been going on for more than 20 years. And over these years, I've moved from, the architect's idealism of, what slums should become in the form of modern mass housing, to thinking about planning and policies with a certain, Marxist zeal that, as if, if the policies are right, there's going to be housing everywhere, right? And to really start thinking about or wanting to sort of engage with urban life in slums without any sort of preset agendas, right? So the book really took form in the process of writing. But there was also something that happened while I was doing this field work, which is, the practice of surveys or producing what they call the governmental documents was, at its peak by all kinds of agencies. So I would go to the field and people would, refuse to share anything, saying that we've done surveys just yesterday, right? And if they did talk, it was about problems, right? No water, no toilets, no road. but they would really not talk about, say, you know, like how do you put a facade together with tiles that you've selected, right? Or the people would have aquarium in their houses, which no one would really talk about, or waste pickers who live in the slum locality had arranged these objects that they collected from the dumping grounds on shelves. And so these, objects, but also experiences, emotions, practices, and largely a lot of the labor of putting a habitat together, right, which is just not about housing, but a lot of labor goes into making a home. It's sort of negated, or what I refer to as expended, right? It's sort of wasted in the creation of knowledge and surveys, or in framing of slums as merely a housing problem, or in policies that define slums largely in terms of, lack of hygiene, amenities, and land tenure. So I was more interested in these residues of what in this book, following Georges Bataille, is referred to as excess. And slums have historically been that part or share of the city which has always been rendered as expendable, something that can be disposed of, right? But this is not an wasting in the sense of, wasting money on weddings or just wasting for the sake of wedding, but it's wasted or rendered as being expendable with the idea of putting them back to work to generate more money, right? For instance, now we see it in this case of the Dharavi redevelopment, which has settled over the years. Uh, the settlement is now being converted into a housing, right, and largely real estate value, right? So people, lives, rhythms, spaces, objects that sort of constitute Dharavi as rendered as being in excess or as being expendable in order to generate another form of excess, which is surplus capital, right? So to sort of, just give a larger frame, the book is really about a particular proposition that it explores, right? Which is that cities everywhere have become sites of expendable lifetimes in our post-industrial neoliberal logic of urbanization. They've exploded beyond the boundaries of what we knew as cities and into a trans-territorial urban network while rendering land, lives, habitats, and rhythms along their way as excess. And what is rendered as excess in this subtractive logic of metropolitan expansion is not expended completely. Right? It's not necessarily expended, but it's liquidated into human technological infrastructures, into unpaid and underpaid labor. Waste land is then made into private property, into data sets for studies, which is again to extract another form of excess, right? Particularly surplus capital or value. But the proposition really is that this liquidation of life doesn't necessarily evaporate it, right? So the life of people doesn't necessarily evaporate. They seep and secrete back in through urban passages, swelling cities beyond their limits along the way. And in doing so, they contaminate cities, make them porous, elusive, swollen, and incoherent. And that is what I want to sort of work with, right? Now, these urban passages, what I refer to as urban passages, and you'll see it as the book talk goes along, are not something that is given, right? But they need to be constellated together by urban residents by putting disparate elements together, like wires, objects, people, ideas, things, rules. All of that is sort of brought together to create these urban passages. So this book explores this proposition on urban life and cities through ethnographic stories of how urban residents, particularly in this fictional slum locality called Toba Nagar, engage in different forms of play with others in different mediums to create these passages. And the four chapters and the stories therein are held together by three conceptual devices. One is the idea of excess, which I just spoke about, and the other is this idea of play and abilities. But before I sort of open up these two concepts, I wanted to sort of start with a particular ethnographic story from the book. So Tubatek Nagar, where this book unfolds, is predominantly a Muslim locality. This demographic is a result of the Hindu-Muslim riots, in the 1980s and 1990s, which led to a huge out-migration of Hindus and an in-migration of Muslims over the years. Today, it has about 35 mosques. Now, while I was studying mosques, during an interview, I asked the secretary of a local mosque about the significance of mosques in the locality. Now, one part of its significance, he told me, is the act of praying in crowds in mosques. So while praying, one kneels and touches one's head to the ground. At that moment, one's head is at others' feet. So the bodily gesture of praying together makes everyone equal in front of each other as well as before God. Another significant aspect of a mosque, he said, is socializing with the Jamaat or the community. So after the namaz, men and women assemble outside mosques or in the streets, outside houses, inquiring about each other's daily affairs, share what they know about each other, and ask questions about who hasn't turned up for namaz that day. On Fridays particularly, life in Tubatek Nagar begins to fade out around 12:30 in the afternoon. Shutting down their businesses early, men begin to move towards the mosque for the Jummah namaz, that is the Friday afternoon prayer, while women start congregating in smaller groups in different houses. The streets approaching the mosques are partly shut and get occupied by men and children for praying. The police constables gather around the mosques to avoid any incidents of communal violence. But before the namaz, while residents wash themselves and prepare for prayers, the imams of different mosques give a sermon, the khutbah. Now, these are narrated by the imams in this loud, melodramatic way on mics and transmitted through loudspeakers that are installed on roofs and minarets. Most often, the khutbahs that are narrated are about the ethics of life vis-a-vis the abjection faced by Muslims in today's world, and they're delivered in the form of stories about Nabi, the Prophet Muhammad. Each story ends with a lesson reiterating how Islamic ethics can allow one to deal with difficult situations. Now, on one such Friday, the story being narrated was like a Grimm's fairy tale. The story was about a devil that had cast a spell of darkness on a village. The sun, the gift giver of energy, was nowhere to be seen. Its disappearance had stalled all life in the village: farming, seasons, religion, and particularly praying. In despair, the followers decided to seek help from the prophet. But none of them had ever seen him or knew where he lived. So everything they knew about him was through his stories, the khutbahs. Now, one of the followers, a child who spent a lot of time grazing goats in the field, thought of a trick. He decided to kidnap one of the prophet's beloved goats from the common grounds and hide it. A while later, seeing that one of the goats hadn't returned, the prophet stepped out in search of the goat. On reaching the village, he found himself in front of the villagers with his goat tied to a rope held by the child. Now, unfortunately, the end and the lesson of the story drowned into another story from a nearby mosque, leaving the lesson of the story open to everyone's interpretations. Now, what is intriguing here are three things. One is the trick that a child plays on the prophet to bring him out into the world, to cast off the spell of darkness. Second, equally intriguing, is the Imam's story of a child's trick as a curious play of hide and seek, as a form of reverence and ethics, which makes religion with its stories and its storytellers as an infrastructural resource of not just ethical values but also ways of being. Not just as ethical or infrastructure resource of not just ethical values, but also of tricks and passages to find light and lighten life in times of darkness. And third, in a locality where resources are scarce, stories circulate in excess at any given point of time. These stories are about experiences, encounters, happenings, futures, travels, gods, kings, sex, love, money, deals, domestic issues, divorces, and many more things. Now, in these stories, encounters with people and objects, spaces, and experiences, sorry, in these stories, encounters with people, objects, spaces, and the experiences that they produce are woven together to present a story to another. These stories are often exchanged and gifted while waiting and idling in different spaces, such as ration card offices, Human Rights Commission offices, NGO offices, streets, and particularly tea shops. These stories are shared with different frequencies and thicknesses of details based on who they're being addressed to. Often these stories intersect with each other, drown each other, other times supplement each other, but are always open to be interpreted and used in different ways. And yet, they find no space in participatory forums of planning, as they do not do the work of what proper planning means. Right? They're always in excess of what counts as planning. But what is really that happens in the sharing of stories? And let me open this here, and let me open the two conceptual ideas that I spoke about, which is the idea of play and its abilities. Right? Now, in the South Asian context, we have the concept of Leela, right, which describes any kind of playing, and more specifically, a spontaneous, carefree, and non-purposive activity. The art historian Kumaraswamy tells us that in religious scripts, the term denotes a divine and indifferent activity through which gods created the world. One can think of how the game of dice and Shakuni's tricks really shaped the civilizational form in Mahabharata, but also its recreation in the form of Ras Leela across South Asia. And each of these stories, right, in the Ras Leela is performed in a different iteration. So he really distinguishes Leela from karma, right, which is this purposeful activity, but also from work that serves some sort of need. So Leela really is a meeting point of extremes such as action and inaction, work and play, sleeping and awakening. It also signifies performance, like swinging and oscillating that can induce trance, as well as role playing, trickeries, impersonations, and charades. There's another there's another sort of conception of play that are really drawn in this book, which is informed largely by the writings of Walter Benjamin, the German theorist. And I do so particularly because of his attention to the role of technological mediums such as toys, films, books, photographs, and architecture in this notion of play. And so this book really looks at objects, people, things, films, and architecture and stories not as something that is preformed, but as mediums. So in his work, so so in his work, there's three sort of ideas of play. One is like play, which means simply an activity in a medium. So for instance, when a child plays with toys or waste objects, the latter are mediums in which they play. Right? Or when they pretend to be a teacher or a windmill or a train or a tree, they really use their body and gestures as medium to play at becoming something else. But in this play, they don't necessarily recreate the world, right? But explore the ability of waste objects to take on new forms, new meanings, and new life. And in doing so, they rescue these waste objects from their predestined fate and open them up to new possible uses and configuration. Now, this play is not restricted to children, but also involves adults, right, who mimic rain, animals, and each other in dance, singing, drawing, photographs, and films. But this play requires a certain kind of a receptivity to say how trees move, or the bodily gestures of the person you're really playing on a screen or on stage as well as a creativity of giving these gesture and movements a bodily form through rehearsals and improvisations, right, in theater. In play acting, what really happens is actors make what you would say is gestures citable. And by citable, which is this, there's a sight and the ability to cite, right? Or the citability of a gesture. And here, citability means two things. One is, say, citing in the sense of, traffic police who gives a citation to interrupt action, particularly speeding on the road. But citing is also like citing of a text, which involves taking the text into a different direction. Right? So there's certain citability of bodily gestures in theaters that is really what he's looking at. So this book is not necessarily about, the spatial practices and saying that these are what, one needs to replicate, but really what spatial practices in slum and the way that this book studies is about looking at the virtual abilities that these spatial practices gesture towards to be able to rethink cities, slums, habitation. Right? But why storytelling and idling in Toba Tek Nagar? And there are three things here. Right? One is this idea of imparting or sharing a story. So when a storyteller tells a story, really parts with, right, or shares a part of their experience with someone else, and receives a part, particularly in the form of listening. Right? Secondly, what is being shared or what is being parted with, say, an experience or a story, also is not necessarily replicated in the same way, but it's transmitted, and in this transmission, it's sort of transformed into something else. So every time you tell a story, it's a different iteration, right? And the third is the spatial aspect of what stories do, which is weaving together experiences and encounters from different times and spaces to weave together a new space. And in this new space of the story, the listener is drawn out. And in the space of the storyteller and the listener both exchange gifts in terms of lessons, details, in terms of rumors, gossips. And in doing so, they are also transposed into somewhere else, but also transformed into something else. For instance, like one doesn't remain the same after listening to a story or sharing a story, right? Which is also why the whole format of, say, therapy or any kind of it's telling stories as a conversation. Right? So one doesn't remain the same. There's something that changes in telling of a story. And it is this ability, this virtual ability in stories to both create a space, but also transform and transpose both the listener and the storyteller, that makes stories a form of a semiotic commons and an infrastructural medium in Toba Tek Nagar. Right, where resources and infrastructures are scarce, stories really become the semiotic commons and mediums for transforming life in a locality in unexpected ways. So, I mean, this is just a drawing about, a lot of the stories that were collected and what kind of impacts does it have, and something that is very unpredictable. So sometimes they sort of travel in strange ways. Sometimes they would, create a network. Sometimes things explode. So it's really storylines that's, really, it's almost like a map of the locality through storylines. But this mimetic play also has a darker side, and one can see it, particularly Michael Taussig, who writes about the idea that a government is a mimetic machine, right? So there's also a mimetic nature to, say, biometrics, to fingerprinting, to the ID cards, right? Which is, it's a copy of you, like a story's iteration of what a person that is sharing. But at the same time, these mimetic technologies, you know, are used to sort of create copies of subjects, right, in the form of fingerprints, IDs, and biometrics. Now, here the medium becomes really an instrumental means to identify illegalities, deviancies, criminalities, and reproduce the systems of power. Here, what is produced is a certain sameness, right, and identities get fixed. Now, to break away from the self-similar cycle of history, one needs to play a hand, which is to gamble. Now, here the emphasis is really on chance and interruption of fate. For example, when dice are thrown up in the air, there is an affirmation of chance. The future opens up to multiple combinations. Anything can happen. But when the dice falls back on the table, they crystallize into a combination which might not be the winning combination. But despite losing, players gamble repeatedly to affirm chance and indeterminacy of future. This form of playing is really driven by not by the desire to win, but the desire to seize chance and deceive the already fixed fate. In other words, in playing her hand, the gambler gestures towards the ability of play to interrupt the recurring patterns of the past and open up new futures despite the risk of losing. So this book really uses the idea of play in an expansive sense, which includes gambling, play acting, playing tricks, taking chances and risks, deceiving others, but also wasting things. Right? So I'll narrate a story that can help ground these play acts and what it tells us about the urban life in slums. So this is a set of three, stories that come together about toilets in Tubatek Nagar. And I'll talk about the name maybe after the talk. So could you tell me about one object in your neighborhood that you find beautiful? Siraj, a resident of Tubatek Nagar, answered, our toilet. Built in 1998, the toilet in Siraj's neighborhood was one of the first toilets to be built under the slum sanitation program in the settlement. The new toilet replaced an older pink toilet, which was built in 1980s. But the toilet was always in a state of constant disrepair. It had only 8 seats for men and women each in a neighborhood of 15,000 residents. It was connected not to the city's sewage system, but to an overburdened underground septic tank. Moreover, it was built as a load-bearing structure on reclaimed marshy land and had begun to sink slowly into the ground. This meant that the sludge from the septic tank would regularly overflow into the neighborhood. Furthermore, the absence of municipally provided water and sewerage infrastructure meant that the local residents had to depend on private tankers for water supply and to pump out the sludge. And these were huge expenses for most local residents. Every few years, just before elections, residents would deposit letters and file petitions with different politicians to replace or rebuild the toilet, but without any success. Pink in color, the old toilet really came to stand for an eternally recurring circular time of development governed by electoral politics. Now, the slum sanitation program was launched by the Mumbai Municipal Corporation as a part of a broader umbrella initiative called the Bombay Sewerage Disposal Project. Funded by the World Bank and the Maharashtra government, the program aimed to strengthen Mumbai's sewerage infrastructure. The SSP was recommended by the World Bank as a mandatory condition for funding this large sewerage project. Now, the SSP aimed to address 4 key areas. One is providing sustainable sanitation facilities in Mumbai slums and connecting them to the city's sewerage network. Second is to reverse the clientelistic relationship between politicians and slum residents by changing the older supply model to a demand model. So slum residents could come together and demand for a toilet. Encouraging community participation by involving NGOs and community-based organizations. And lastly, instituting a new self-sustainable financial model in a sense of ownership amongst the residents. Now, to institute this last goal, the SSP mandated an initial contribution of rupees 100 per individual and rupees 500 per family. And in return, they would be provided a pass, a monthly pass, a yearly pass at a very minimal cost. It also, the program to be passed required consent of at least 50% of the households in order to assure financial sustainability of the project. Now, the new SSP in Siraj's neighborhood is an aesthetically striking, uh, is an aesthetically striking structure. It is built with raft foundation whose RCC piles travel 30 feet below to the ground to find stability in hard rocks below the marsh. The building surfaces are carefully and attentively adorned with differently piled patterned tiles. The toilet has metered electricity and water connection, and the sludge is disposed into the nearby nala using an ad hoc pipe that was absent in the plumbing drawing submitted to the municipality. The presence of these different elements help them avoid depending on the local politician. However, this does not mean that toilet was built without the municipal councillor's involvement. She was invited as the guest of honor for the Bhumi Pujan, and a granite placard is put outside the toilet, as a way of getting blessings so that they could collaborate on further issues. A cast iron staircase at the back of the toilet now leads up to a terrace where which is used by residents for various activities such as tuition classes, stitching classes, and so on. The terrace floor too is decorated with mosaic tiles and potted with green plants. A small channel sort of runs around the edge of the terrace floor that now carries rainwater to the underground water storage tank. A short, stout man with a cropped beard, Mahmood, is the toilet's caretaker as well as the head of the CBO that operates and maintains it. His office is located on the terrace next to the overhead tank, and he resides with his family at the other end of the terrace. He told me that he had played a huge role in getting the SSP toilet built. He organized the residents to form the CBO, liaised, facilitated the conversation between the residents, NGO, and the municipality, and most importantly, gave up his house to make space for a bigger toilet. Now, in the recent years, his son has taken over as the caretaker. Now, the access to the toilet works like this. So, the older residents who can provide a proof of legal residence avail a prepaid pass against a payment of 500 rupees. Residents who migrated after 2000 are allowed to purchase prepaid passes as and when they avail their proof of legal residence. Now, allowing post-2000 residents is a unique feature of his toilet, and it's not a part of the SSP. Newer migrants who live as subtenants are not provided a monthly pass. They pay per visit, and this is largely the primary income source for the maintenance of the toilet. Conversely, relatives or local residents visiting them from outside are allowed to use the toilet for free. For him, it's a matter of pride when visitors express their awe at the beauty and the cleanliness of his toilet, or become envious of their relatives who are members of it. Over the years, his toilet has become renowned in the international development circle as a best practice of slum sanitation. So photos of award ceremonies, certificates from international organizations, travelogues of international conferences, newspaper cuttings, photographs of visits by NGOs are all archived on his computer, walls, and his social media. Now, Mehmood has really used the celebrated toilet as a medium to develop strong connection with different actors, including bureaucrats, international and national development agencies. For instance, he allows specific NGOs to showcase his toilet as theirs to get international funding. And in turn, he can call upon these NGOs when he needs for funds and favors. Furthermore, given his affiliations and knowledge, residents come to him to help in navigating all manners of bureaucratic procedures, like getting them listed on below poverty line list, resolving informal land issues, availing formal water and electricity connections, or just using his network in government offices for timely completion of paperwork. And he assists them without any expectations or returns. During one of our many conversations, he explained his renovations plan to me while arranging the tiles on his table. He said, I wanted the inside walls to be glossy and those outside to be rough. It'll give the toilet a natural look from the outside and a posh look on the inside. And then I want to install speakers, which you don't necessarily see in other toilets. And I agreed and said, yes, you can play songs. He said, not songs, but news, melodies, and instrumental music. It'll help people relax while using the toilet. He really wanted the toilet to be a pleasurable space for use, but as well as an object of everyone's attention. Unfortunately, the NGOs had refused to fund his renovation plans, to which Mahmood politely responded by refusing to allow his toilet to be showcased to donors. Now, Nizam, who's another toilet operator in Tuba Nagar, has a different story to tell about Mahmood's toilet. According to Nizam, Mahmood had deceived local residents who were unable to afford the initial contribution for the toilet. He convinced them to sign up for the program by offering to pay their part of the contribution. The plan was to get approvals from 50% of households so that the project goes through. However, once the toilet was built, he refused to hand these residents their family passes and demanded that the paper visits until they paid them their initial contribution or their share of initial contribution. Furthermore, Mahmood never actually owned a house next to the toilet, he told me. It was really a story that he made up just to justify him living about the toilet to visitors. Now, Nizam has a toilet story too. He too was relocated to Tubatek Nagar during the emergency era demolitions. Back then, his neighborhood lacked most services. Nizam and some of his friends were instrumental in assembling some of them. So, access road, electricity lines, bus routes, and so on. A few years later, he left his job as a private security guard and began working with a local NGO that recently set up an office in the locality. As months passed by, he grew frustrated with the NGO's moral stance, which prohibited any kind of work outside the field of health and education. So he eventually quit the NGO and started one of his own. For the project, for the first project, Nizam applied for implementing the community awareness and organization component of the SSP. The plan was to obtain a SSP contract and continue working in his own locality. Unfortunately, the municipality assigned them to a different part, to a different slum in the city. Now, despite the disappointment, they went on to work in these localities, build relationships with municipal officials, local politicians, contractors, and local leaders. A few months later, an opportunity opened up due to a failed SSP project. He diverted funds from that project to build a toilet in his own neighborhood. Now, this toilet was built outside the ambit of the SSP. After completion, the toilet was handed over to his organization for operation and maintenance on a 5-year lease. Despite being outside the SSP's ambit, he operated on SSP's rule, which is monthly passes and paper visit and forming a CBO. A few months later, the SSP contract awarded to his organization came to an end. He stopped being actively involved in the organization due to ill health, but continued to operate the toilet as a source of income. A few years later, another NGO approached Nizam. That NGO was awarded the contract to build a SSP toilet in the same neighborhood where his toilet was located. They wanted to demolish his toilet and rebuild a bigger SSP toilet in its place. The NGO ran a private for-profit construction company that had been awarded the contract to construct this toilet. The NGO and its associated construction company both had much to gain from demolishing and rebuilding, not just in terms of the contract money, but also in terms of getting international funds. After a few exchanges and a few back and forth, Nizam, who was in need of the money, agreed to sell the toilet for a price that included its cost of construction and an expected income over the next 3 years. Now, seeing the success of SSP toilets in the locality, Qasim, another, a youth group leader in the adjacent neighborhood, decided to replicate the model and build his own toilet. He identified an empty site for the toilet. All the requisite paperwork had been successfully completed, and the process of excavating land started. But the very next day, the older residents in his neighborhood stopped the excavation and opposed the project. They claimed that they were involved in reclaiming the land along with the local politicians and hence demanded a part of the land for themselves in order to build some houses. This matter was then taken to the community hall. The Maulvis were invited to give their blessings, and the Quran was placed on the stage so that the meeting would go peacefully. The external interests, like local politicians, municipal officials, and NGOs, were all excluded from the negotiations. The proceedings went peacefully, but the participants couldn't arrive at an agreement. That very night, an anonymous group of men attacked Qasim in front of his house. As tensions rose, the toilet project was stalled. The matter couldn't go to the elected local politician because he had struck a deal with the older residents for a share in those houses. The Maulvis couldn't be called upon to intervene because they had a deal with the municipal councillor for building a new mosque in the area. Now, after the violence, a few weeks later, stories began to circulate in the entire locality that a violence had happened over a piece of land, and the story had reached the municipal office. There was gossip that the ward officer was planning to send a team to verify the paperwork of all the residents around the toilet site, which could lead to demolitions of many of the houses. Now, these are strange figures that operate in the slum localities, and this book sort of conceptualizes, based on this, the Hindi film figure of the Kamine, right, which are these scoundrels and bastards who don't have a fixed identity. They're deceitful, constantly shape-shifting, play-acting, gambling, and deceiving their fellow beings, to put things together, to build forms together, infrastructures together, institutions together. Now, to understand this form of operation, it is also important to locate the toilets in the larger context of the city, where this idea of, where the spectral real estate inflation, religious territorialization, privatization of all public assets, but also the whole circulation of the world-class city aesthetics about its beauty, pleasure, and melodies is an exclusive one. So in building these toilets, these figures, although they mimic, right, these world-class city aesthetics of the shiny tiles, the music, the beauty and pleasure, as well as mimic the politics of the developmental world, where NGOs are always looking to route international and government funds through their toilet projects. But this miming is not just a miming of, not a simple miming, but it's also deceiving of this aesthetic order, right, by creating them in spaces where they aren't supposed to be. Now, on these other hands, these operators also mimic the discourse and the practices of the SSP and play the roles that are assigned to them. But this is only to learn how to navigate their way through the developmental world and its twists and turns. So this navigation really involves, moving between different worlds, oneself, one's locality, the city's politics, the politics of the developmental world, of political transactions, and constantly trying on different roles and different routes, but never really belonging to anything completely, always deceiving each of them. So this toilet is neither an ideal community toilet in the sense that is intended by the SSP based on ideas of inclusion and sense of ownership, and nor is it based on the ideals of equality and collectivity. Right? But what these toilets really, or what these deceptions really gesture towards, is the ability to make these models, right, the SSP models, the roles of caretakers, the roles and identities and forms that are assigned, right, to each one. They really gesture that all of this is really citable in the sense of they can always be transposed and transformed. A deceptive city then requires a very different mode of inhabitation and different registration of ethics, a different register of ethics. So in my observations during the field work, Mahmud's fellow residents or other toilet operators never refused to seek his assistance or collaborate with him, despite knowing this deceptive nature. Likewise, at the beginning of the story, the fellow resident Siraj's identification of the toilet as our toilet, right, is also continual claim that leaves the toilet's ownership open-ended. Here, the desire for identification, for empathy, and the rush to judgments are interrupted so that things remain in play. Urban residents don't attempt to fix the city or each other so as to make things work. You know, Instead, they play with each other and play at being others so that things and the self can continuously take on other forms. Now, in doing so, deceptive operations render the attempts to model and identify in cities as really inoperative, right? That they don't necessarily work, but also gesturing towards the possibility of citing models and identities infinitely through deceptive operations. You know, so I'll try and sort of, summarize, which is, so in settlements, urban residents often find themselves in the middle of circumstances that are not of their making. These are economic structures, caste hierarchies, governmental programs, urban missions, mega projects, communal violence, and spatial territorialization. What residents can really do in such situations, which is the positions they can occupy, the jobs they can take up, the schemes they're eligible for, the projects they can initiate, the roles and identities they can take on, the resources and networks they can draw on is delimited in the sense of it's very restricted. And yet, despite these delimitations, urban residents engage in different kinds of play acts to generate a sense of movement away from fixed cities. In these play acts, disparate elements are brought together, but this bringing together is also a form, this convergence is also a form of divergence, in the sense they come together only to depart in unexpected ways. So in a story, they come together only to depart as something else. In toilets, things are brought together, but not to replicate something, but to convert it into something else. Right? And this is all unexpected, nothing pre-planned as such. So, in this process, wherein singular lives come together and depart in mediums without any kind of an overarching framework or a predetermined goal, this process is what bears the name urban. Right? So, it's not about demography, not about the empirics, but really this process of coming together and departing that I give the name urban. These urban convergences and divergences in cities create tensions and intensifications that swell the city, expand it, and extend it beyond itself. So, swelling city, despite its pathological connotations, signals towards change, movement, and passage of that which is contained but beyond its limit. Right? So, a swelling city, despite its pathological connotations, is not a boundary that sort of separates and divides, but it is really a zone of experimental becoming. So rather than trying to rewrite the script or achieve an end, what if we embrace the swelling city for whatever it is without any kind of subtractions? What if we embrace the city for whatever it is, which includes all the irreparable relationships between communities, between groups that cannot be recovered or resolved. What if we embrace the city for whatever it is? So no matter what it is, it always matters. So what if we embrace the city neither as something to be achieved or actualized, nor as a destination, but as a medium when played in, opens up the possibility to become whatever. So, what if we extend the ability of a child to play at becoming whatever to the cities rather than trying to get a hold of them like a wrestler trying to pin them down? Over the years, these urban holds of wrestlers have taken on different names. The world-class city, smart city, creative city, slum-free city, zero garbage city. Right? And here the city is constructed by a cast of actors, policymaker, corporate groups, civil society groups, foreign consultants, NGOs. So the city is constructed here as a problem space that needs to be fixed through programs and missions. These programs and missions involve specific spatial practices such as measuring, classifying, modeling, interreferencing, and ranking, through which cities and urban local bodies are made to enter into a comparative and competitive relationship with each other. Simultaneously, older codes of addressing older problems through architecture and planning are being rewritten using new networks of information and communication technologies and spatial data infrastructures. This process too is driven by corporations, civil society organizations, and government bodies that strive to make urban movements, both present and future, traceable, computable, and programmable using real-time data and stacks of computational layers. What these programs aim to achieve is really an interoperability and a sense of stabilization across the disparate urban movements and frequencies by amplifying on the standardizing potentials. Now, despite these efforts to get a hold of the city and make them smart, many of these missions and programs don't really work out as intended. They get lost along the way in internal power struggles, the refusal of urban local bodies to loosen their hold on territories, and the lack of faith of urban local bodies in the credibility of the programs. But yet they sign up for the programs to stay in the game, to continue the flow of capital and resources to their constituencies, which they could then deceitfully use for something else. So cities, as whatever they are always deceptive. They appear to be working as cities as per a given order of things, but they're always on their way to becoming something other than what they are. They appear to be fixed by boundaries, lines, and rules, but they're always on their move to somewhere else. Urban residents in slum localities are attentive to this infinite playful abilities in cities to become whatever, and hence are drawn to them despite all the struggles and restrictions. They do find themselves inhabiting cities in the middle of things, of violence, of hierarchies, of programs and missions, and are restricted by them. But in this middle, things are always in media res. They're always in flux. So this middle is always also a medium, right, between what exists, right, what is actual, and what is possible. Right? So this middle is always also medium to travel between the actual of what is and the black sky of unknown possibilities. And it is this magical abilities of cities that make them so enchanting despite all their limitations. Yeah?
He'll mix. So, joining me is Isha Pethe. Isha is an architect and currently works with Herbs, uh, who are um, who are also doing works in similar tone. And she's a friend of ours now and has worked with Prasad earlier. Uh, uh, is it fine, Joel? Okay, I'll just wait for Joel to. second. We'll, I mean, uh, Prasad is not unknown to us, so we can have a we have a free conversation, actually a flowing free conversation, and I think it will be useful because uh, a lot of uh, what happens in studios over here, at classes over here, is also in some ways connected uh, to what he's been talking about, to connect it to the book. So, uh, wanting more participation from everybody over here. Uh, just let me know, Joel, when we can start. Yeah, so thanks, Prasad, and thanks for the book again. Um, the uh, you've seen the book closely, and I've seen the book closely as well, and one cannot kind of escape how personal it is. How 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 much you are in the text. I mean, whether it is personal conversations, personal letters, personal notes, diaries, and and I think that's also a methodological kind of uh, you know leap to bring in that personal very actively into this whole discussion and into the whole mission of theorizing and retheorizing and reworking. Uh, and overlap with this personal is fiction and uh, you know uh, uh, montage of stories and so many other uh, things which 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 run a little bit of a risk of being anecdotal, or rather which the uh, uh, um, a social judicial scrutiny, which most text aspires to be, it doesn't bother. This work doesn't bother, and I understand the the the, the form, because how do you write the city if not personally? Uh, my uh, but in many ways it's on the edge. It's on the edge of this personal, non-personal, fiction, non-fiction, uh, experience, uh, analysis. It runs on this edge, and that's the joy of the book also. It's a joy of the book, and it's a very specific, and you're borrowing threads from, I mean, you're continuing threads from Benjamin, from Bataille, from Simon, from so many people. I want you to kind of speak a little bit more about this form that you choose to write. You know, it's not. It doesn't bother about being empirical. It doesn't bother about being, judicially right. It doesn't bother about giving evidence of any. Want you to kind of open that up a little bit, uh, as to uh, how do you land up here, no?
Uh, I mean, I actually think the book is still not as fictional and experimental as I like would have liked it to be, and this is just the perils of publications. Even just the title is something that would have been different, you know. Uh, but there were three things that I would, want to say. One is that so uh, when I started field work and before that, and this is also due to a PhD supervisor. So this, if you, I don't know if you've read, but this guy, the Walter Benjamin, who's a, one of a prominent German theorist, was a big part of my education, and uh, he did a lot of these different formats of writings, right? So he did radio programs for children, right, where he would talk about, say, a fish market and what happens there and why children should engage with it. So there were radio programs particularly for children. And at the same time, I was also reading the Grimm's fairy tales, which were, about these violent lessons that are given to children. Uh, you know, and so there's so there was one part of it which is, a part of Benjamin's essay was where he talks that, what is it that affects one, right? It's not as if, and I've tried to keep it as much as stories even today, which is what is it that affects one when one reads something, right? And he would say that there is something about stories that travel a lot more, and there's something really affects you as you read it, right? And so that was one part of it, which is that it really wanted the book not. Uh, I mean, part of it is that you have to publish and as academics, but the other part of it is was really to discover a form of writing that moves away from what we've probably done over the years, which is we did surveys and fill forms, but also sort of did drawings and make plans and wrote articles. But to try out something that I felt was would travel not just to adults but to children. So even the idea was to actually get these stories and publish a different kind of a book, which is not about the theory, but just stories that can be told. And this is also to do with Manto, who is a big influence on the book. So short stories as a format was something that I was really looking for. The other part of it is really, it, when you're in the field, but also just how life works, there is, in a way, flash moment, right? So you're there. So I would be in a tea shop for hours over days, in a film theater, watching films for I don't know how many months. But what you sort of grasp, or certain situation moments happen in a moment. Like there's a story about this land deal that happens in 10 minutes and everything sort of disappears, and then there are houses that are built next week, and so all of this happens in 10 moments, right? And or the three toilets, everyone is telling a story about someone else. So how do you know what is the veracity of a story? And then is that the point of it, right? Or is it to say that everyone in some sense is deceiving each other? So you work with that idea of it. So it's not about to know if it's true or false, but what is it that happens with it? what is it that one does with a story to get a toilet built, to sort of get something repaired, uh, and so that was also something that influenced how the book is written. Uh, the personal largely is because I think the book uh, also changed how I was thinking uh, uh, through this book about slums and how I wanted to sort of. It's also probably one of, you know, I think I'd worked on slums for 20 years and I was like, I need to move to something else. But I also wanted to write the book in a way that wasn't something that I'd done before, but in a way where, there's uh, that it stays with me as I'm reading it. So it's also a collection of diary entries, conversations with friends about it. Uh, so it's all of it is there. So it's also a collection of it's almost like a personal diary that one recounts. So that is also the idea of storytelling, is that you're recounting stories not just of people but about also yourselves as you're writing this book. So that was also the part of it. Yeah. But it's, yeah, I mean, it's good to sort of be on the line when no one really knows what is really happening. But yeah.
Hello. Yeah. First, I'll thank Prasad for inviting me here today. And I will talk through my very limited experience of, working in slums. So I might have questions which are a bit, I don't know, not so with a lot of scholarship. So, like first thing that you realize that if you saw the board which was saying that "faltu mein baithna mana hai," but really, if you look at the kind of stories that are collected, they are mostly through. I mean, I might be assuming, but mostly through idle talk, or like when you are not really going there on the field to look at something specifically. But then also I have this question. It might be a better question towards the end, but I'll just ask it now. So there was, so you as a field going on a field work, not though you were living or staying or being there for hours, you were coming from somewhere else and not really from that space. So one is that, how was your experience of this, just finding people um, to idle talk, to, have that kind of idle talk, because a lot of everybody might be in search of some kind of a livelihood or in some like, so yeah, that's the first question. And the second question is, after you kind of completed writing some of these stories, did you kind of go back and have conversation about the stories that you've written in this book? So yeah, these are the two.
Uh, no, actually, so when I started, when I was doing the field work, I had this, uh, I mean, Prasad, like, there's a lot of, I've probably rented 4 houses. Uh, and yeah, I mean, the idea was that the book isn't a book that was supposed to, that you take the book back to the community. That wasn't the idea of the book. And so the field work was really where that happened. So, and it wasn't, and I also didn't want to go to the book with, or to go to the field with this idea of that, I'm going to change something, or, change their life or do something good. That wasn't the idea. So it was largely that then how do you sort of operate in the field, which is in terms of, exchanges of other kind. So, a part of that exchange was monetary exchange, which is renting out 4 houses at different points in time. Sometimes, but it was also that, looking for a house is a big thing. Like, like the brokers would take you to this house and tell you what is there, what is not. That it was also a process of learning. So, I mean, I remember this was way back. Like, if you want to study, pan shops, you have to eat pan, right? So, if you want to know how slums get built, you have to know, you have to be able to rent them out and sort of know how they work, right? So, wasted a lot of money doing that. But that was also the part of what the field work was. That this other part of it is also was that I've been like in this process I've spent a lot more money than what is required. So I know I'm being cheated on certain things, and this is like you sort of go along with it to you know so that is also that part of it. The other was you exchange documents. So a lot of the policies that are collected, maps that are collected, I would share. So that was the process. I mean, the fieldwork really became a different form of a practice, right? Where you're engaging with them. I mean, you are the one who's sort of going there, and they're not invited. But sort of developing these different forms of exchanges of information, of of documents, of money. So to do research on films, I would spend time and eat whatever samosa, papad, whatever, like spend hours watching all kinds of films. So that was the mode of operation, right? It wasn't that I would talk to them to get information. So I watched so many films, and at the end of it, when I'm outside, maybe writing notes, then people would start having conversations, right? So that is where that really opens up. So I've had probably 100 cups of tea, which is where you get one story, right? So that is really the form of the field work. Uh, and and it's not, and it also developed actually in the field, which is, I would sit making notes, and there'll be people watching, like staring at you for like half an hour, and you don't know what it is. At the end of it, when you start to walk up, like a man will come and ask, like, what are you doing here? Can I get a job? Right? But there's a mode of attention to everything that is going around you, right? Be it someone just sitting, doing nothing. So that is really the ideal talk, which is, that you're sitting in a tea shop, but you're always aware of of what is going on, right? And that's really where the stories kind of come from. And I didn't think, I mean, again, like the idea wasn't, I know you operate in that sort of field where, you're really engaging with the community on a different register, right? For me, it was very different. It was really, uh, you know, to develop forms of relationships that as much as possible don't become like I'm drawing information to write a book, but there's some form of exchange that is there in which things emerge. So a lot of the stories in NGOs offices and stuff also happened where they would ask you for documents and policies to get maps and some census books and something, and then you would sit there for hours and then something turns up. So that is really what the mode of working was.
uh, Isha and Prasad. And continuing with this, it's not because when we were also doing field work together, and Rupali, Rohit is here, and many others. Uh, it's it's not, it wasn't the I mean, we were doing work. I mean, survey was a work. We were doing work in the sense we had to make a plan, so you need to do work to make the plan. Just to realize the uh, the limitations of that method, you know, you then realize that you're trying to save something which which first of all you can't save it. Secondly, it doesn't want to be saved by you. It's that kind of a situation. And it's also that you're trying to kind of hold it through uh, conceptual tools that you have with you, but it's not getting held. It's kind of slipping between your fingers. So then this whole thing about let's reconfigure and rethink and rework this whole engagement. It's not a surprise that one is not surprised because you're living there. But it's basically your optic is not adjusted to kind of engage, and then you realize, you know, it does that. The dialectic, you know, it's not really the uh, uh, saving or being saved, or it's the way to work with it is to dance with it, to kind of, you know, figure out a way to swing with it. And then is where you get entangled uh, into this thing. And, you know, continuing in the tone which Isha kind of posed it, uh, there are two things. One is, then what about, you know, uh, all the differences and deprivations and exploitations and segregations you mentioned in, you know, struggles of peoples and rights and all of those. You know, how do you want to kind of, how does the, not what do you do about them, how does the work engage with it? You know, what about, that's one part of it. The other part of it is, I mean, particularly in the last chapter, I think the last chapter or second last chapter, it's, I mean, you worked also in the planning office. I also worked in the planning office, and you know that the plan, the planners are also kind of, you know, trying to play. So they're also playing, and they're also kind of, you know, enjoying, and they're also kind of twisting and turning and doing all kinds of things. So it's not really in opposition that the the planners kind of, you know, work as against, you know, the diagrams of density or whatever that was in the plan of Bombay, you know, that taking from that uh, urban age thing. I think that all the density thing kind of thing. So it's, there is a constant, you know, give and take that goes on between, so to say, so to say, the state or the non-state or the in-betweeners and the everybody else. And, you know, it's sometimes it becomes indistinguishable, you know. And Lisa is here. I mean, she can also kind of, you know, like her book also, this indistinguishable agent of city production. You know, who, it's very difficult to identify who it is. So that's the second part, that, you know, it's the it's a morph more than, you know, a excess, so to say. You know, it's a part of the city. You know, in these two, one is, you know, one is uh, uh, that there is a one is picking up from Isha. You know, what about this? And the other, I want I wanted to kind of tell us a story, because there is story. Tell us a story from where you would kind of start, you know, uh, 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 because that's what the promise of the book is, that you approach this uh, from 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 this uh, from this thick, you know, discussion. So how do you approach this? Uh, uh, not a, not necessarily a duality, uh, but also, you know, something which comes up, because the first chapter kind of, you know, is, it says that this is it, this is not, this is it, this kind of, you know, defines the surplus, excess, that story. And the last chapter brackets it with this planning and against planning kind of a story in some, in that in that diagram onwards. But the center of the book is, you know, it's a, it It's what kind of discusses the city really really forcefully the way you're talking about it now. I wanted to kind of approach this as to why these brackets, you know.
Uh, no, I mean, I don't. Uh, I mean, as a thinker, I don't think in oppositions, and I mean, so the first chapter on the stories really starts with this. The Mumbai development planning is being made, and there's a participatory forum that is assembled, where you have, you know, so all the NGOs and the CBOs and the academics and the planners and everyone, and they each come with a certain idea of what they're looking for, right? So like the Marxist academics are talking about the policies and with neoliberalism and how policies need to be more social and how we can organize for more housing. And sort of at the end of it, I think both of us were there where like slum residents just started talking about what is going on in slums, and planners don't know what to do with it. That it's not as if planners work like that, right? I'm sure they work in stories and there's bribing and all of that sort of happens. It's so it was the book really started off with a sense of how what is the form of thinking that we think of with cities, right? And so Bataille becomes very important because he's saying that any kind of a proposition when it's negated, like, and this is the largely the dialectical model of thinking, that I say something that it's someone says something in opposition, and there's part of it that is left out and a part of it that sort of take to create this higher form of knowledge, right? So I was interested in what is it that happens with it, right? So Bataille's book is really like, at the end of the world, if we've reached all our, supreme form of, society and knowledge, what happens to all the anxiety and the joy and, things that we've left out along the way? So I refer to the excess particularly in terms of what is it that is getting left along the way, and that is really what I was interested in. Now, it is. I mean, if you see the Dharavi project, it is something that is like where settlements do habitats do get disposed. They are expendable. Right? Like all the demolitions that happen for whatever reasons they are, right? But it does make life so, and there is that part of it that exists, right? So it's not a denial of difference or caste hierarchies when I'm looking at waste workers, or really that like there was a part of the book about the waste workers who really have to get drunk to work, right? Because you can't really work otherwise, and uh, but even in that moment, they'll collect an object that they want to keep in the house. So this that is happening at the same time this is happening. So it's not necessarily in opposition. So I don't think that so planning might be happening at the same time. There are stories that are informing planning. At the same time, there's something else that is at the same time this is happening. And so the book also sort of starts off with that, struggle of thinking about. So it's really it starts off with this departure from planning to then enter into this other world, uh, and it was. See, I forgot the question. So no, it was really about uh, that there is a certain thickness of things that what the book talks about, but there is also the plan that exists, right? A plan is made by stories, but the plan still exists, right? Uh, and so tomorrow, if there's a DP road that is going cutting through, it will get demolished, and that still exists. But then there is a part of there is, so it's not necessarily centering itself around planning. So it starts off there and sort of goes in all kinds of directions. Uh, it's Mm.
bracket it with the idea of excess and to kind of uh, bring in the planner, you know,
Mm.
because it's a narration of the city which is in a completely different register,
Right, but
you
it
know.
wasn't the planner. It was actually all the you know thinkers that have fallen along the way. So you include the Marxist thinkers of the sort of work with this class and dialectics. It was in response to all the Hegelian thought. It was really sort of trying to bounce off that. So the planner, because that's the field. So the planner comes in and goes away at the beginning of the book. Uh, but it's also, you know, uh, that if the book, I mean, the field is where, like, you know, we do work in the field of planning, geography, and architecture. So uh, there was also that, uh, and I think it was more of a, like a itch to sort of to get it out in the book. So you sort of start with the planners and then we sort of, go somewhere else. So uh, yeah, I think that is it's not necessarily thinking about what can planning be. It's not really that, but it's largely the book is also that the planning is already happening. That it's not like the planners are looking for something, but the planning is really happening. So that is yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about the form of the book. So it's a fiction. So, uh, you've not really named the, I mean, it's called Toba Tek Nagar. So also this thing that a lot of things might be, really like happening in reality or uh, said so. So when you were as a writer, when you were trying to juggle between this whatever your field work was and whatever you were trying to write a story yourself as well. So how did you really what is real and what is unreal, and how are you actually writing it in a form of a fiction story? So
Uh, so uh, there was so there's this. I mean, Michael talks. He was an anthropologist, so he has this term called the fictocriticism, which is that you're being critical but through stories. So and uh, y- the it, it's so again. I mean, it was to think about. I think it was also a time when I was hanging out a lot with my relatives' children. And so, they had story cubes that they would play it with, and a lot of that was going on there, right? And the only way to sort of, this is also to do with the anxiety of knowledge systems and what we're talking about, right? But, so we were traveling in a car and they're very anxious and crying, and the only thing that sort of calms them down is this story cube game where and this is also the form of it is like the dice is strange. So the dice has these different figures. It's a spider or something and something else, and whatever it lands on, you have to continue the story from there. So I've told a story, someone else tells a story from there, so it sort of continues. And that was also the form of thinking, is how do you calm one's anxiety but also other people's anxiety through stories. So really that is what it was. But again, uh, I still don't. So, I've met people who've given me a lot of information, but I still don't know their name or what they do, right? And that is just how that the world operates. So I've spent so many hours in this. It's in the book, in this Human Rights Commission office, where I've actually gotten a lot of the stories from also, but I still don't know what that person did for a job or an income. So I've spent like maybe 3 months with him, but I still don't know what it really does. Uh, And so, and at that point, I was, thinking that it's really, and every evening, people used to collect in this Human Rights Commission office. So it's a Human Rights Commission office to, identify like human rights violation and work with people in the slum. But what would happen is that people would just sit around. Sometimes in the evening, even women would come, and everyone just telling story about something, and it gets resolved. So, so I was like, this is where, uh, like, it's a form that, one, again, to do with the veracity of things or the surveys, right? It's a form that does things, right, which where you don't have to, we don't necessarily think about. So again, the book is really about, inhabits a different kind of a world. And there's a book, story in the book, which is this Italo Calvino story where, it is about a city where everyone steals from each other, and then an honest person enters, and then the whole society sort of collapses, right? And so if you enter this kind of a world with that, those kinds of questions, you're not able to operate, right? So you have to let go of the idea of is it real or unreal, right? Or the I operate like the story. So you sort of operate in that mode. Uh, and that is really what a lot of learning of the field has been, is that I don't think anyone has ever asked me about, is it real? And like, did this happen? That when you're telling a story or people are sharing, no one would ever ask, did this happen? Right? No one is asking a question, but people are just telling stories and they take part of it and, carry it and do something else with it. And that's the mode of operation. That is also why the book is like that, right? And it's a book about something that operates in that world, or that register, and so you sort of hold on to it. uh, and so Tobatek Nagar, and I should probably talk about it a bit, which is, I don't know if you've read the Sadat Hassan Manto story about, so it's based in post-partition, and it's, where there are these lunatic asylums in both countries, and the inmates, as they were called, are being sent back to their respective countries based on religion. So, Hindus and Sikhs from Pakistan are being sent to India, and Muslims from India are being sent there to Pakistan. And then there's the Sikh inmate who keeps saying Toba Tek Singh, Toba Tek Singh, because that is his native village and that is where he wants to be, right? And he sort of refuses, right, to go to India or Pakistan, and sort of dies in this no man's land. And so a lot of the slums there, the localities are named like that, right? Which is, there'll be a Rafi Nagar, which is Mohammed Rafi, and there'll be some connotation to that. So, but it's also a context which is, so again, the second part of the story, which is Toba Tek Singh, is actually a place in Pakistan, which was this town at the intersection of these travel routes, and people would wait there to, stay for the night and get food and sort of travel on, right? And so no one comes to a city saying that I want to live in a slum, right? A slum is that place where you're doing things to move on from, right? So you're trying to use a slum to get to somewhere else. Right? So people are always on their way, even if they're staying in a slum, they're on their way or wanting to go somewhere else. And that is also why the name is, and in that process of, along the way, what are the stories that they're collecting and telling? So that is really what the book was about. Yeah.
We'll have a lot of things to say, but any responses or anything?
Thanks so much, Prasad, because I mean, in some ways, we've been also talking about, it's all students here, a lot of them are doing thesis, and a lot of the conversations are about a form of research, and in some ways I think what you've done is opened up this kind of experimental form of research. And so, I mean, just two questions, not completely related. Um, the first question is probably a more projective question, like in the sense that, um, yeah, you don't talk, you talk about not thinking through an instrumentalist frame, but then kind of posit this, a kind of a experimental mode of seeing, it's kind of a deep seeing. But also you're located in an architecture college, you're kind of also, we're talking about um, projective futures in some ways. So I'm wondering, I mean, I'm not through an instrumentalist frame, but if you had to continue this kind of thick storytelling, and this kind of mode of thinking through an affective lens, through a kind of, a thick seeing and sensing, what would that kind of projective mode of thinking of the city be? You know, so yeah, I mean, that's one question. Also because, I mean, we're constantly talking about the projective, and the projective doesn't have to be in like building or whatever, but like, what does it mean to think of a projective mode of thinking of storytelling, in seeing cities, and thinking of futures from there, right? So I think that's one question. The second, I think a little more, about this transition, when you're talking about like the fact that nobody wants to live in slums, and it's always this kind of being at crossroads. And but we've also seen through our work that, we've seen people have lived all their lives, generation, second generation, third generation, and they've also in some ways not been at crossroads, but uh, but try to settle a place in different modes, so really kind of rooting oneself, like, and a constant need to sort of improve habitation, to kind of settle a place, so what does then, I mean, how does that speak to this kind of idea of thinking of slums as places of being at crossroads? So two questions.
No, I'll take the second. I mean, this. I mean, I meant slums in the sense of, no one wants to come to stay in the slums, in the sense of how we understand them, right? Which is like, no one wants to go stay in a place which is next to a dumping ground, right? And that is part of the, right? No one wants to live in a space where there are, there is a lack of infrastructure, right? And so there is that, and one does stay there because there's a delimitation of resources and networks and all this, so you do land up there, right? And it's the process, it's the process of really making it into something else, right? For instance, there is this, so I look at this youth group which runs this YouTube film series. It's like an episodic series called Govandika CID. Yeah. And so they do, these crime stories, and then they only act in it, and it's they'll have blood, and so there's this one scene in that film which I talk about where it's shot in a Chinese hotel, and part of it is as if it's pretending to be a forensic lab. So, they'll take the thread car, those reels, and they'll make a microscope out of it. And so uh, so one is looking at the slum as constantly as something else. So it's not that one wants to move away or out of the slum, but how do you constantly make it into something else, and that is what they really are looking for, right? And that is where all these, putting up the infrastructures, making films, all kinds of things. That is, so it's about creating a habitat which is otherwise we understand slums, but how do you create a habitat that is not what it is, which is what the term slum will be. So it's constantly wanting to make it into something else, and that is what the book really is uh, looking at. And so in that, and that's the sort of, it's also a larger question of how do you look at settlements, and I use the term settlements, but I didn't want to, which is uh, like what happens if we look at ourselves not as people who settle but as sort of moving, right? That we're not I mean, one is that everyone dies, but also that with constantly, you know, uh, looking to that it's that like life is not necessarily a settlement but a movement. That is largely where. So one is moving through a slum, not just in terms of wanting to go stay in a middle class apartment, but in a way of that one is moving through a slum in terms of life, right? And along that building of life, what is it that happens? So that is where, so it's not that one wants to, that slums are bad, I want to move up, but that one is moving through it constantly, right? And along the way that you're looking for how to do things differently, how to make a house differently, how to, make a film or whatever it is, like how to make your urban life different. And so that is the movement that really it was that I was talking about. The future, yeah, it is. I mean, the idea was of a black future in all its connotations. It, I mean, so there's two parts to it. One is, like working in an architecture school, uh, and that is also why I structured the talk in a particular way, is to think about again, I mean, something that I've been thinking about, like how do we think about architecture, and large part of, we do is giving things a form, right? But what does it mean to think about architecture as a medium, right? Because we also as a form that exists and is studied. But I was reading the chawls of Mumbai, where this is a story about the BDD chawls, which no one wanted to live in, and then there's the whole, right. So the form has stayed the same, but then the whole association and life changes at a certain point, and then it starts becoming a whole different active life, right? And so really, what if we think about architecture not, as a giving form, but thinking about it as a medium for us to push something, right, or for things to move. I know that the Keller is telling book is there, the medium design, the medium thing, but which doesn't really do any of that, right? But uh, so that is one part of really thinking about it. Uh, yeah, I'm way bad thinking future, so I'm not necessarily the person to answer it. I mean, the other part of it is just to, you know, it's that there's a mode of gambling, right? Like you're hedging bets on something, and something more might work, something might not work. And so the the projection from this work is to really, try out everything possible. Uh, it's not, again, and that goes back to thinking about the form of the book. It's not a book that is trying to be anything in particular, right? It's to keep itself open, where you might want something you can take, and or you let it be, but there's something, uh, uh, it's more like, if anything, I would think it's trying to sort of think about a projective idea of a city that really is nothing in particular, right? It's very generic, like it can be anything whatsoever. Uh, so it's, and if you sort of hold on to that, you're able to see a lot more things. Because if you're thinking about that, you know, you want the city a particular way, then that is what you look for. So you sort of keep it open-ended in that sense. Uh, and it really is trying to think about this idea of the abilities. That's, you know, for me it was a important tool, is that I'm not looking at what happens as if these are best practices, but there's something about making a film in a Chinese corner as if it's a lab that says that there is a possibility of the space to become something else, and people are able to see it, right? That's the ability that's there, and so we work with that to project a different kind of future, right? Or that people are constantly changing roles, and there is this ability to take on 100 kinds of jobs, right? People do 100 kinds of jobs, people do 100 kinds of things to find what they want to do. And so there's that, you know, they all, there are these certain abilities that exist that one can build on to think about a future. So yeah.
Hello. Um, Thank you so much for this. I'm really looking forward to the book. I'm familiar with some of these characters um, from previous discussions. I'm not sure this is a question, but it's something that maybe it's like a comment that I'm wondering if you can respond to. It seems to me that there's a contradiction in the account and just where you ended up right now in thinking about these abilities and the futures, the sort of the creative futures that they can engender, perhaps. And I was really struck just now by your discussion of gambling and speculation, how everybody's kind of trying to figure out what everybody else is doing, right? And so like that's the play. Like the play is this kind of um, interpretation. So we can even think about it as like like everybody's acting, but it's not like, but it's not deception. And I guess this is, I kept coming back to your discussion of deception and the presumption that that makes about audiencehood and receptivity. So there's certain people that are acting and there's certain people that are being deceived. But then you say, okay, like people know that they're being deceived. But even if, by putting it that way, it seems to me like you're underplaying the power of your argument or of your material, which shows that it's not just that nobody's deceived, it's that it seems from your material that that's not the language that the drama or that the acting is speaking, right? It's not like a literal communicative act where it's like, I'm gonna say something and I assume that people are gonna believe me, but no, they're not really deceived, right? There's some other way in which people are interpreting the city and everybody else's kind of experimental play. And this comes back, Prasad, to what you were saying. I haven't read the book yet, but the final chapter about how the planners are also playing, right? I don't, I mean, I'm not sure what I'm thinking about, but I do think, I mean, from my own experience working in the city, it does seem that, and I think this is the reason why I feel like your material is is theoretically more powerful than you're giving it credit for, is that, like coming back to, notions of excess or, this kind of thing, it presumes that this kind of like rational planning idea, it takes that too seriously as like an honest idiom, right? Where like people are being deceived by it or not deceived. And then there's the excess that kind of goes on outside it. But what if we think of, it seems to me that what your material, what your ethnography is showing is that it's not that there's like the rational planning and then there's the kind of playful excess that happens outside of that, but in fact that there's a kind of, there's something else going on in this play, which is not just excess, but which in fact produces the city and enable, and it's not sort of devoid of power, right? So it's not like, okay, this is not how planning happens and then this happens too. Like this actually is a power infused. So then the question becomes like, okay, who is able to speculate on what, who is able to interpret, how do people do the work of interpretation, right? Like if everybody, it's not just that people are not deceived, it's that they're actively, like their lives depend on navigating this world of like illusions and performances. And like that's really powerful. Like whoever can do that, it seems that there's more kind of political potential in the material than your theorization of it as excess is giving it credit for. And so I'm wondering if I'm misreading your use of the word deception or, yeah.
I mean, two things to say about deception. So there is this whole sort of lineage of, thinking about, the Behrupia, right? Or, which is this, uh, uh, like this figure with, multiple faces, right? And can take on different forms. And then there is, so there were two, three sources. There was this whole, stories of the tricksters that sort of travel in, the US and Canada, which is this, and even in Africa, about the spiders who are seeing everything upside down and sort of, would trick their fellow beings to, say, get things, and they also fail, right? So, which is what it is. Right? The three stories are very different. Which is one is where this, you know, it might, it has allowed him to use the toilet as a medium to get, to get recognition, sort of, to do a lot of things. The second one is very different, and the third one is where it's sort of, it's a gamble that you sort of fail, right? Uh, so it, I, the idea of deception, you know, it has two. Actually, it's more than, I mean, I did frame it here as deception. I mean, in the book, it's actually sort of starts with this film. I don't know if you've seen. It's called Kamine, which is about, which is sort of unfolds in a day's time, and everyone is trying to, and it's about this bag of drug and money that everyone's trying to get, and everyone's sort of, playing the other one out, right? Uh, and uh, so the deception is not so much that I am being deceived or someone else is being deceived. It's that SSP model is being deceived in some sense. So that is where it's being pitched. So the deceptions is not so much about uh, that everyone is aware that this SSP model exists, and but it has, but the model is what is being deceived in some sense, in the sense of that now we have 100 models. Actually, each of the SSP model, the program toilet that you see, it's has nothing to do with the SSP. It looks like something else. Like it's a, what, like it's a different model. And what all of these programs do is that they've assigned each of them roles, that you have to be a caretaker, there's a CBO, there's this and there's that, and everyone has to have these assigned roles and jobs and things. So the deception is to actually deceive these programs and identities that get assigned. And so it's that world in which everyone sort of recognizes that, right? And uh, it's also a deception in the sense that we don't necessarily know how to politically theorize these characters. I mean, there's the Blom-Janssen's urban charisma, the charismatic figures, and but we don't necessarily know how to theorize. So in some sense, the deception also has to do with the fact that the categories and ideas and judgments that we work with aren't necessarily, there's something uh, else that is going on. So it's that, the idea of deception is sort of in that expansive sense. Uh, I mean, the question of excess is really, I completely understand that the rational logic, like the rational planning isn't there, but we still do have a plan, and that is what I keep uh, coming back to, is that it is made of all this, everything else, but uh, there are still planning schools, right? There's still schools in which we teach about planning. There's still the modes of surveys that all the institutions are doing. There are all the data collectors who are aggregating, right? We're all in some sort of a data set. So those modes do exist, uh, and I don't mean it that they are these complete, right, models of working, right, and that is why, I mean, actually, if you go back, that the figure of the 0 and 1 is not to do with, actually, I mean, I think in the book it's written about very differently, which is that in the computational form of thinking, everything gets converted into these binaries. But there's something between the 0 and 1, which is this infinity that cannot ever be calculated. Right? So it's really about that uncalculatedness of the calculated world that I was really interested in. Uh, that we're trying to make cities programmable, calculable, but we're not necessarily interested. Like, I mean, there's something uncalculated that happens, and that is what they're working with. There's something that isn't calculated beforehand, which is where the future sort of, the question comes up, is that it's really it's really thinking about what cannot be calculated beforehand, and what do you do with that. And it's a, it's a mathematical issue, that between the 0 and 1 there exists an infinity where hundreds of, so the 0 and 1 is also, this idea of this Marxist rejection of everything, and the one as if, this is the only idea that one can follow. But there's hundreds of infinite possibilities within that. So the drawing is, I mean, I think it's read, I presented it differently, but that's really what the drawing is about. Uh, yeah, maybe I was obsessed, but I don't really know. But and it sort of gave a frame for thinking. Uh, it I think it was more the like there's this doubleness of the idea of excess, right? That is particularly what I was interested in, which is that I render something as excess and then convert it into something, a different kind of an excess, right? So if you look at the Dharavi project, which is, you convert it into something that is expendable, but that is really put into. So there's two kinds of surpluses that are working, right? But uh, and that is really what spoke to me in terms of thinking about the whole history of slums, which is this part that is always, so he calls it the occur shell, right, which is something that is there but not there, so it's absent and present at the same. So it's for instance, like sex, which is required but it's still taboo, right, and that's what makes it this something that we sort of shun away from, but it's as indispensable part of it, right. So it's really that to make land, you have to render slums inaccessible, as expendable, at the same time convert it into land, right? So that's the so again, and I think that's why the stories are accessible, but they're still there, right? But we still don't think about them as being a really important part of it. And I think that's that paradoxical nature of that part of how we construct systems that I was really thinking about. So I don't think any time in the book I thought, rational planning exists or works, or, we've had people who work in these development plans and know all the, stories that go into making a development plan and stuff like that. But it's still that there is, you know, if I have to still think about, uh, you know, like, which is the question of the future. One thinks like, how do you, I mean, how we teach people to design a neighborhood is, no one is saying that, you know, to make stories like the future is over. Like, there's something logical that one has to, and so that is, it's a problem of how we think, right? And I'm not saying that how we think, but it's a problem of a thought system that any time you think of something, something is going to be left out, right? And that's really what, uh, you know, and it doesn't go away, right? It haunts you. It's sort of kind of like the whole trauma of life. No, it's really that, right? So it stays, right? And what is it that it does then is what the idea was to sort of explore. Yeah.
I'm wondering if we should just break up, kind of. With Prasad, you can't ask a question; you have to have a conversation. So um, uh, I really enjoyed reading your book. I mean, I've read your thesis earlier, and probably I was in a different mind space then, and reading it again is so thoroughly pleasurable. Such an architectural book. Four architectural analogies: passage, play, constellations, and now that, since you've kind of come to see, you're thinking about architectural compositions. And those are kind of four things, one sees them again and again in the book. And that I felt that that's really the flight of imagination. That if a book is pleasurable to read, that it is not only the unpacking that one does in the book, but what it offers the reader in terms of the flight of imagination that one takes. So these are analogies that one architects maybe cannot consume directly, but have to do work with them to be able to translate them in their own, discipline as such. Um, so I mean, I have a lot to converse, but I won't kind of discuss. I'll just make one point. Uh, I really enjoyed your provocation on the idea of the constellation, which you subdued um, in this presentation in the book, but it kind of much more forcefully comes in your PhD thesis. And I thought the idea of the constellation, um, it's a reading of space and time that allows many people to participate, and doesn't distinguish between professionals and non-professionals, or politicians and residents or NGOs and nothing, but it's a constellating world which is always kind of dynamic in its play. And everybody can play within it. Whether you are a resident, whether you are a planner, you'll always be playing, engaging with that play, because it's never static. So that's the promise that it kind of offers to me. Doesn't make the distinction between planning, non-plan, architecture, non-architecture, but invites everybody to play. I just wanted to ask you a question regarding the constellation. Two kinds of questions. One is, um, the urban constellations are a way of thinking about a city without its constitutive outside. And could you kind of talk to a little bit more to open this up? Because on the one hand, you have a debate going on in human geography, in critical human geography, one which kind of relies on a political economy frame, which looks at cities without a constitutive outside. And on the other hand, the assemblage kind of scholarships, which I assume you probably are situated in. So what does really the constellating, or the constellation of forces offer in terms of engaging with the world for diverse kinds of people. I mean, and including architects without making that distinction, because you speak about a certain kind of engagement, but it can be open to anything else. And my second question was, you spoke about your uh, desire to write this book in the form of stories, like children's stories. I'm wondering whether in terms of thinking about, if one has to think about a companion to this book, when one draws out these stories, not literally in the form of drawing, but even text or other form, what does Constellation offer in terms of thinking about the form?
Uh, I think, I mean, uh, yeah, so there's this, a lot of the recent work, right, on planetary urbanization, right, which is about this implosion and explosion where, cities are now everywhere, uh, and that the whole planet is sort of urbanized. So there was that one, you know, scholarship that kind of exists. Uh, and for me, the constellation actually came from two things. One is, obviously Benjamin, and the other is that I met, like speaking to this one of the guys, the toilet operator, right? Like you ask him like, how does something happen? He'll say like the stars have to be aligned, right? Like, the paperwork has to happen, this has to happen, that has to happen. So it all has to be aligned for a toilet to get built, right? And so there is, in that, there's this element of it's work, in the sense of people are doing work to, organize for things, getting pipes and, contractors and material and funds and all of those things, which is what really the toilet is. Right? It's in some sense, the toilet itself is a constellation. It's not an object, but it's a constellation of things that come together. Right? So built form, largely I'm looking at it, and I think that's how I also describe it, is not as something that is preformed, but it sort of gets constellated. And in that process, it's a the coming together is also in some sense an explosion, in the sense of the toilet coming together is going to sort of divert things away, right, from what they were. So that is where I mean this idea of convergence and divergence of, which is what I call about urban, is the coming together of things in a toilet is really going to, change things. So that people, like a toilet operator's life is going to change, right? How everyone else's life is going to change. They're going to take flights into other worlds. Film theaters do that, right? So that idea of conversion and divergence is really, but it's really, it's not some, it has chance, it has, but it's also work that one does. So the book in that sense is that it's work about bringing these elements together to make something out of it. It didn't have a form. In terms of the, yeah, the form of a book is something that I would have to think about. If, uh, yeah. Yeah. No, I had thought of it as a book that, uh, I had ideas of writing it as a picture book, but which, the publisher never sort of agreed to. But it, uh, yeah, it's something I need to think about what that form of the book is going to be. Yeah. Bogota.
there's actually, thanks, Prasad, and thanks, Isha, for jumping in. Uh, it's actually quite interesting. I was thinking of Arabian Nights and Scheherazade. Uh, Scheherazade is considered to be the author of Arabian Nights, and it's interesting that she's called Scheherazade. You know, it's like, so when you spoke about the and it's there in this um, that the Imam jumps into another story in that. So Arabian Nights, the structure of Arabian Nights is interesting because it's basically it's one story and then that gets one element of it gets tied up to another story. And one the other element gets tied up. It's almost like a labyrinth. You know the and it's multiple stories. The collection of stories is actually multiple stories, but then you can read it as one whole story. You can read it as small stories. You can read it as a constellation of stories. You can read it as you know some other, and I think that is interesting, and it's kind of and the book does that in many ways. It kind of opens up this Arabian Nights of city for you. Actually it does that in multiple ways, and I think that's the to kind of present the city as this labyrinth of aspirations and desires, but also actual material and experiments and gambles and the whole series of things, and then and navigating it, and when you navigate this labyrinth, you have you know Agamben, and you have uh, Batai and Benjamin and Tausig emerging as companions, as devils, as angels, as and accompanying you really, like in the Arabian Nights, really. And I think that's the whole joy of the book, really. You kind of the form is so interesting that it does that, and and I think the uh, uh, also the kind of plurality it presents to us about the city, the multiple ways and multiple kind of uh, uh, movements and possibilities, and I think for Indian urbanism, I think it's an important shift, particularly at the moment when there are either you know social science work which gets stuck in uh, techno-legal judicial language, or reports on a whole series of things. So, so moving out of that, if you look at it as an urbanistic work, it's an important shift. Of course, there have been people who do that in the fictional world, but this kind of comes in as a field study based, as a whole, with 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 drawing from earlier uh, works, a whole, and it kind of presents you a city which is this Arabian Nights labyrinth, actually. And I think it's an important book at this moment for us to kind of uh, think through the city. And I have sent the PDF copy. I don't think uh, it's a what kind of a version it is. I don't know. It's what I've sent it. You can circulate it further. You can also buy. I just checked. It's 4,000 rupees. Not so bad. Not so bad. It's 3,700 rupees in Amazon. It was 12. It was 12,000. So just now I checked. I think because of us, it kind of Got it down. So you can also buy, but it's a great book to have over your Christmas vacation, you know, to accompany you. Okay. So thanks, Prasad. Thanks again. Uh,